title of my talk is Bahiya Lives and Loves. Bahiya is spelled Bahiya. In one of the shortest teachings in the Pali Canon, the Buddha addressed a man named Bahiya, and he said to him, in reference to the seen, there will be only the seen. In reference to the heard, only the heard. In reference to the sensed, only the sensed. That is how you should train yourself. When for you, there will be only the seen in reference to the seen, only the heard in reference to the heard, only the sensed in reference to the sensed, only the cognized in reference to the cognized. Then, Bahiya, there is no you in terms of that. When there is no you in terms of that, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor yonder nor between the two. This, just this, is the end of suffering. So the Buddha is talking about seeing and hearing and the cognized and the sensed. And the cognized, I think he's referring to thoughts. And the sensed, he's referring to smell, taste, and touch. And we should mention that thinking is considered a sense, like seeing, one of the sense doors, just like seeing or hearing are the other senses that we commonly think of. When we sense something, that's exactly what happens. We conclude, I'm sensing it, we are sensing it, they are sensing it. They're my thoughts. I hear it, my body touches this, and so forth. This is happening to me. We envision a self at the center of all this. But the Buddha is saying, nope, that's not the way it is. Here, in this summary of his teaching, he's saying there's only seeing and hearing and thinking and so forth. And no you is involved. Thoughts and no thinker. And just this, he says, is the end of suffering. So in other words, he's saying, when there is no self, there is no suffering. When there's no sense of self, no suffering. When there is a sense of self, that is suffering. So to give a little bit of backstory about this particular sutra, which is found in the Majjhima Nikaya, I believe. It's found in the Udana scripture. Bahiya was an ascetic, and he was clothed only in bark cloth. I'm not exactly sure what bark cloth is, but you get the idea that it's pretty Spartan, pretty ascetic. You can imagine some kind of bark that's maybe tied with rope or something really simple. Now it's said that Bahiya was greatly respected. In fact, the sutra says he was worshipped, revered, honored, venerated, and given homage. But one day while Bahiya was meditating, a question arose to him, and he thought, am I an arahant, or am I on the path to arahantship? Now, arahant is the highest level of spiritual awakening prior to becoming a Buddha. And the scripture goes on to say that a devata, a female deity, came to Bahiya out of compassion for him, and she said to him, very bluntly, she said, no, you're not. You're not even on the path to being an arahant. Well, I think about what Bahiya's response must have been inside of himself, like major crash. I mean, he's just given his life to something, in this case to awakening. And maybe you might think about how you would feel under such a circumstance. You've gone to all kinds of lengths to accomplish whatever it is, denying yourself this and that in order to pursue your goal. Denying, think of what you've said no to. That's your version of bark cloth. And say you have attained considerable respect, all kinds of affirmation from others, and then all of a sudden, here comes a goddess who says, no, you're not even in the ballpark of trying to attain what you want. And maybe we can translate or see that goddess here might be the still voice within, your wisdom voice. So I think that really the question is, what would I do? What would I do under such circumstances? One goddess or all the others who are venerating me? Would I say something like, sorry, goddess, but everybody else is telling me I'm doing great. I've invested years of time in all this work and I'm getting somewhere, and I'm not going to listen to what you're saying. I'm going to stick with my way. And then you turn your back or your attention away from her. And you try to forget her words. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Maybe you do or don't forget them, but it would be your effort. What would you do? Well, you've got to give it to Bahiya. He had such integrity and such sincerity. He listened to her. And then he said, well, then who can teach me? Who is an arahant? And she told him about the Buddha, who was in the capital city of Savatthi, in the country of Kosala. She said, go here, there and find him. And Bahiya did. He dropped everything. The scripture says he then and there departed. In other words, he didn't make any plans. There was no procrastination. He said, no, well, he didn't say, I got to get my things in order and I'll leave on Friday. None of that. He just started off and he walked to Savatthi. And it could have been many miles away, depending on wherever Bahiya was at the time. He went to Anathapindika's park. And this was a large reserve, kind of what monasteries were like in those times before there were any really settled monasteries. It was a park that had been given to the Buddha for his use and the use of his monks when they wished to settle for a time, as they typically did during the rainy season. And he went there. And he went in and he asked where the Buddha was, and some of the monks said, well, he wasn't at the park at the time. He was in town, as they said, amid the houses, on alms round. Now, alms round were the daily practice of monks and nuns too, begging for food. Not allowed, they weren't allowed to cook their own food. This was according to the disciplinary rules, the Vinaya. And we might say that during the Buddha's time, the monks were mainly wanderers during his day. They hadn't settled to live full-time in monasteries. And they would come to a place like Anathapindika's park and settle there for a period during the rains, but then they'd be on their way again. A settled way of life would have meant a change, probably, in terms of their eating habits. They might have required more to cook their own food. At any rate, they relied entirely and camped usually outside of towns or small villages and went into town always to beg for food. They walked silently, and the lay people, both rich and poor, would be honored to give them food. It was considered a blessing. It was generosity. And this was the kind of reciprocity there was between the monastics and the lay people. So it's said that Bahiya hurriedly left the park and he went into town looking for the Buddha. And he spotted him there with his begging bowl in hand, walking down one of the streets. Probably it wouldn't have been too hard to find him. The monks didn't go on alms round alone. Usually there were at least two. And probably there was a little crowd of monks around the Buddha. So they would have been very likely in a richer section of town where people could afford to feed several monks. And townspeople would notice them on their alms round. So Bahiya probably just had to ask, and where is the Blessed One? Have you seen him? And he was told what street the Buddha was on. I think we might also have to conclude that among the group of monks who were with the Buddha that day must have been Ananda, the Buddha's attendant, because he's the one who later recorded the Buddha's words, and he had a photographic memory. So we assume he had to have been there at this point. But I think it's really intriguing to think, imagine Bahiya's urgency at this moment. His whole life was on the line. He had just thrown over everything. And he was waiting for the words of the Buddha, the Blessed One, to guide him. And I think we've all seen movies of lovers who meet after a long separation, walking down a beach or something like that toward each other. There's a shot of one and then a shot of another, and there's great intensity. I think that must have been something, what it might have been like for Bahiya. His attention fully focused on the Buddha who he saw at the distance, forgetting all the other monks around him. He focuses on the Buddha, and if it were a movie, the camera shots would have been on Bahiya, and then from Bahiya's point of view, shooting a clip of the Buddha. And I think while the Buddha no doubt knew Bahiya was coming because he was prescient, I suspect he probably didn't look up at Bahiya. He just continued walking. According to the scripture, the Buddha was calm, collected, tranquil, all the good things. But Bahiya couldn't have been calm. He spotted the Buddha in the distance. He walked toward him, coming closer and closer, and his emotion must have been rising, and then he was right there in front of the Buddha. And he throws himself down, bark cloth and all. His head was probably touching the Buddha's feet, as in the custom of the day. And he pleaded with the Buddha, "Teach me Dhamma, Blessed One." That's Bhagava. "Teach me Dhamma, O well-gone one." That's Tathagata. Teach me the Dhamma that will be for my long-term welfare and bliss. And you can imagine, it must have been a heart's cry. And the Buddha responded, "No, not now, Bahiya." After all that effort and emotional build-up, giving up everything, imagine the movie again. And the two lovers finally meet after a long separation, and one says, "Nope, now's not a good time, let's meet later." It's pretty anticlimactic. So I might say the Buddha responded like this. I think it's understandable from his point of view. First of all, it was Pindapat. It was alms rounds. The monks didn't teach while they were walking on alms rounds. They were largely silent. This was their practice, being in the world but not distracted by it. And begging for food in a worldly setting, but maintaining their attention inwardly. Sometimes a wealthy patron would invite them in on their alms round, give them food, and then request teachings. And the monks would eat and then provide teaching. But while they were walking amid the houses, they didn't teach. But Bahiya didn't want to take no for an answer. So he asked a second time, and he got the same response. "No, not now, Bahiya." Then he asked a third time, and the Buddha relented. There's a tradition in Asia, asking 3 times. And if the first 2 answers are no, you ask a third time, and very likely it will be a yes. And the Buddha did relent, and he gave the teaching. In reference to the seen, there will be only the seen. In reference to the heard, only the heard. In reference to the sensed, only the sensed. That is how you should train yourself. For when for you there will be only the seen, etc., 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 then Bahiya, there is no you in terms of that. When there is no you in terms of that, there is no you there. When there is no you there, you are neither here nor yonder nor between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. It was a short teaching. I think it was short, first of all, because of the location. They were standing in the scorching sun, probably, in the middle of a dusty street. There are passers-by, ox carts, dogs, children playing, dust, noise, sweat, and probably people crowding around them. It certainly wasn't an appropriate place to give the teaching. The teaching should be offered, and customarily was, when everyone was seated, and the Buddha was sitting higher than the others out of respect, and all were ready to listen with undivided attention. Also, the custom was that the monks needed to eat by noon. Still do, by the way. They usually accepted food and went back to the monastery and shared with others. And they finished by noon so that the food wouldn't go bad in the heat. So there was no dawdling on alms round. But after the third request, the Buddha gave the teaching anyway. And when Bahiya heard it, he instantly realized deeply the truth of what it pointed to, and he woke up. Maybe Bahiya bowed in gratitude after the teachings. The scripture doesn't say exactly what happened, except we know he left the Buddha. And we don't know where he was heading. Scripture doesn't say that either. But wherever it was, he crossed a field, and there was a cow there in that field with her calf. I would assume he came between the two. And the cow, seeing him as a threat, charged him in an effort to protect her calf. She trampled him, and he died. Right there, that afternoon. So the scripture says, according to the scripture, that on returning home from the alms round, the Buddha saw Bahiya's body. And maybe that's true, or maybe someone else saw it and a little bit later told the Buddha. However it exactly happened, the Buddha instructed the monks to cremate Bahiya's body and build a small stupa, a memorial, according to the custom of the time. After the monks did that, maybe it was that evening, maybe the next day, they asked the Buddha about Bahiya's spiritual awareness, the level of his spiritual awareness. And this was something the monks often did after someone who had been in the Buddha's presence died. And they said, what's his destination? What is his future state? That was a way of asking about his spiritual awareness, because they were really asking then about his level of rebirth. Now, not to get into rebirth here, but the Buddha, who would have understood Bahiya's level of awakening the moment he awakened. He didn't have to be told. It's probable that the Bahiya didn't jump up when he heard the Buddha's teaching and say, I've just awakened. He probably didn't say anything. But the Buddha knew. And he replied to his monks, Monks, Bahiya of the bark cloth was wise. He practiced the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, and did not pester me with issues related to the Dhamma. Bahiya of the bark cloth, monks, is totally unbound. I love that comment. He didn't pester me. The implication is, unlike many of you, Bahiya had no need to ask questions. The truth was seen, transformation had happened, and he just left. Maybe he'd been planning to visit the Buddha that evening at the monastery. That was customary. Maybe not. But at any rate, there's been a lot of discussion about this particular sutta. A whole lot more words than the sutta contains in itself. And I'm going to add a few more now. Because he pointed out, he said, Bahiya of the bark cloth is totally unbound. Totally unbound. What does that mean? It means that Bahiya was an arahant, completely free. Hence, amongst those who believe in rebirth, it would mean there would be no more rebirth. It meant the end, the goal of the Buddha's way. And one of the words the Buddha used frequently to describe the goal was nibbana, or nirvana. Nibbana is the Pali word. Other words to describe the Buddha, nibbana, that the Buddha used from time to time: the unfashioned, the end, the true, the beyond, the very hard to see, peace, the deathless, pure, the ultimate. All of these were words that the Buddha used that are referenced in the scriptures, the Pali Canon. A phrase that the Buddha did not use is pure awareness. It's a phrase, though, that we use these days, and it means the same thing: the end, the ultimate, that which is non-conceptual. But whatever the words, they're all just words. They point in the direction, but of course, the totally unbound can't be described in words. Pure awareness, a term that I'll use here, means has no bounds, no limits. In fact, there's no sense of self. And hence, pure awareness, the state of the end, the ultimate. There is no suffering. Just this is the end of suffering, which is why the Buddha could say, totally free. We can assume that one who lives totally free lives from pure awareness, and in fact recognizes there's no one, no self there. Most of us, of course, live from our personal, we're gripped by our personal narrative, our stories, our sense of self. We occupy the center of our world, which means we understand life through our personal narratives. We're identified with it no matter how broad-minded, how generous we might be. Even the most unselfish beings who are always doing for others, as long as there is a sense of I am doing, or you are there, then that's not pure awareness. That's being gripped by personal narrative, being driven by it, being the center of one's personal narrative. In other words, self-centered. There's a me that is doing things, a me that is either expressing my needs or foregoing them, but there are needs, there's a me. Haven't we all seen this in our lives? For me, nothing is ever perfect, or it can't be for very long. It might just be for a moment when conditions come around and everything feels great. They're just right in the moment. But then something always happens. Something always changes, like, whoops, this one just got away. And there we are, we're back in me-ing again, I-ing again. Pure awareness, however, is not like that. There's no story. It's recognizing directly that there's another dimension of life. Reality, recognizing that reality is something more and other than personal narrative. That seeing life through the sense of a personal narrative is not only true. To experience life as though our personal narrative were the only truth, which is how most of us do it, is an illusion. For most of us, those of us who have directly seen, understood, experienced pure awareness, we usually dance back and forth. What kind of dancing happens? Back and forth between pure awareness and a sense of self. From sense of self, my history, my family, my issues, my house, my possessions, my suffering. Those things we take into consideration and sometimes, maybe often, are driven by it. From pure awareness, there's freedom from suffering. There is simply awareness, perfection. And so for those who have recognized directly pure awareness, often there's a sense of a backing and forthing between one and the other, sometimes getting lost. But from pure awareness, the being within and recognizing the needs of daily life is not a problem. But when we get lost in it and begin identifying with it, whoops, right there, back into a sense of self. I think it's interesting going back to the sutra now. The Buddha commented that Bahiya of the bark cloth monks is totally unbound. I like the verb tense here. It's important. Present tense. Bahiya said it, the Buddha said it after Bahiya had already died. And it points to timelessness. To timelessness, the Bahiya. For the being that was Bahiya, there's no longer time. He died within hours, maybe minutes of having heard the Buddha's words. And I think that we might hear it and say, oh, too bad. He hardly lived at all, had any time to enjoy it afterwards. Kind of like enlightenment might be like retirement. A person can work and plan for years to retire, but no sooner does he do that than the day he does, or shortly thereafter, he becomes sick or disabled or dies. That Bahiya had practiced intensely all those years, but no sooner had he awakened than he died. Too bad. But in fact, there's something else being said here. And that is, there's no time involved any longer. The Chinese have a saying, a pine tree that lives for 1,000 years and an insect that lives for a day, they're the same. Timelessness, the now. The moment is eternity. And that's what Bahiya realized. Or the Sufi poet Hafiz commented, time is just a passing fad. For Bahiya, when he awoke, time became a passing fad, a moment, an hour, 20 years, all the same. If Bahiya had lived, maybe he would have continued wearing his bark cloth, or maybe not. And in fact, it wouldn't have mattered, not in the same way anymore. It wouldn't have signified the same thing as it had before he awakened. Before, it was part of his effort to awaken, part of his asceticism, his renunciation of things of this world. But now that he was awakened, it could have been discarded. The Buddha spoke of his teaching like a raft. He said one takes it to the other shore, but after that, it's to be discarded. After that, it doesn't have the same kind of relevance anymore. One can choose to live as one always has, or not. It doesn't make any difference. Bahiya might have continued wearing bark cloth, or not. No difference. Didn't matter. It's so easy to conclude that, one who is totally unbound really doesn't love, can't love. They're so removed. Couldn't possibly love another being or anything else. But that's not true. Such a one becomes love. The Buddha didn't talk much about love in this respect, but in fact, his teaching, although he didn't put it in those terms, really was about that. The Buddha focused on the end of suffering, how to achieve it. He doesn't say much about what the end of suffering was. He doesn't talk, to my knowledge, about the end of suffering and love. But the end of suffering, that's the goal of his teaching. It's about not being caught up in neediness, inner knots, the sankharas, about opinions and beliefs, about a sense of self, not being caught in any of that. So it's a matter of going through, exploring those things. It's not suggesting we go around and forget it. And we often talk about all of this, about fully exploring our conditioning. The end of suffering, though, is freedom. And that's the same as love. This is not freedom to love, which implies a person who's doing the loving. No, it's about freedom is love. It's openness. There's no resistance. There are no obstacles. It's just open presence, transparency. That's true love. Not the possessive love of oneself for another or for a situation or a place. In freedom, there are no barriers to love. It is simply being love. Greeting everything with the openness that is love. Appreciating the moment. Not focusing on what is in the moment. That's what we usually do, don't we? Focus externally. If we like what's in the moment, if we like what's going on at the present, great. If we like the beings around us, or love them, wonderful. And if we don't, we go the other way. But in the pure being love simply means that's the nature of what one is. Focusing externally is not wrong. It's not to suggest that. But it is limited. Being love is a different reality. Here's how Joseph Goldstein expressed it in his book, The Experience of Insight. He talks about a kind of love that as he said, is higher even than universal loving kindness. He calls it the highest love. And he says, this love is the natural harmony which comes from the breaking down of barriers arising out of the concept of self. No I, no other. It's free of the concept of self, of I. When you experience the highest level of love, you experience all the other levels as well. It's the natural expression of the Dharma. So all the other levels as well, he points out. And Stephen Levine, in his book Who Dies, says, love, like faith, is the natural space of an open heart and mind, an unnameable wholeness of being, in which we each dissolve out of our separateness. And finally, the poet laureate Billy Collins, in his down-to-earth style, in his poem Aimless Love, he says this: this morning, as I walked along the lakeshore, I fell in love with a wren. And later in the day, with a mouse the cat had dropped under the dining room table. In the shadows of an autumn evening, I fell for a seamstress, still at her machine in the tailor's window. And later for a bowl of broth, steam rising like smoke from a naval battle. This is the best kind of love, I thought, without recompense, without gifts or unkind words, without suspicion or silence on the telephone. The love of the chestnut, the jazz cap and one hand on the wheel. No lust, no slam of the door. The love of the miniature orange tree, the clean white shirt, the hot evening shower, the highway that cuts across Florida. No waiting, no huffiness or rancor, just a twinge every now and then for the wren who had built her nest on the low branch overhanging the water, and for the dead mouse, still dressed in its light brown suit. But my heart is always propped up in a field on its tripod, ready for the next arrow. After I carried the mouse by the tail to a pile of leaves in the woods, I found myself standing at the bathroom sink, gazing down affectionately at the soap, so patient and soluble, so at home in its pale green soap dish. I could feel myself falling again as I felt its turning in my wet hands and caught the scent of lavender and stone. Pure love. So that's what Bahiya became or is. And so we can say Bahiya lives and Bahiya loves. Thank you for listening.